assert that we are experiencing a crisis of leadership today. In our political, economic, and religious life, those entrusted to lead, inspire, and protect all the people in their charge appear to be falling down on the job. That isn't anything new. But in our own country, our political leaders seem to be so preoccupied with politics or selfish ambition that they cannot conduct the government's business in a way that promotes the general welfare and establish the common good. And our so-called captains of industry seek ever more ways to exploit our labor and charge us higher prices solely for their bottom lines, regardless of the people's ability to pay or even their ability to make a decent living. And our religious leaders are so focused on shoring up their institutions and gaining political power that they are no longer able to speak truth to the nations, to do justice and righteousness. So the question, as we saw those names and as we consider how our government fails us, as we consider how our leaders seem to be falling down on the job, what is our word when leaders fail us? Oh, we can immediately go to Facebook and say, oh, this one is doing this and this one is doing that. But what is our word when leaders fail us? What do we have to say to the world when the government seems incapable of doing justice and righteousness? Now, the premise of my question said that what is our word is that we have a word, that we are empowered to say something. Isaiah was tasked with bringing a word to his own context when the people of God were experiencing a crisis of leadership. And we often miss this part of Isaiah's prophetic oracle because we Christians, we read this familiar passage during the season of Advent and in our Christmas worship as an interpretation of our experience of Jesus. And that is a good thing. We understand that Jesus is this expression of God's intention to do justice and righteousness. But we tend to focus on this passage as a prophecy fulfilled in our context, as opposed to seeing how forceful and consequential it is in calling God's people to understand that God has an intention for the world. Oh, and I'm here to tell you, some may say that's political. No. God has an intention. We can't say that God cares about all of creation and then assume that God has nothing to say in how the government treats that creation. There's a step missing. We can't say God loves us all and then looks the other way when the government doesn't do right by us. No, if God indeed loves us, then God cares what governments do to us. So Isaiah knew this and has to remind God's leaders and God's people that no matter what is going on around them, no matter how hard things are, no matter how much oppression they have to endure, God has not given up on God's plan for the future for them. God has not given up on God's insistence that we do justice and righteousness. Oh, King Ahaz did not see it. He didn't trust God to handle what was going on. The nation of Judah was surrounded on all sides by more powerful nations, and the holy city of Jerusalem was threatened with destruction. And the king feared that he would lose his kingdom. And so he wanted to join with the other more powerful nations to protect his kingdom from these other nations. Oh, Ahaz forgot about God's promise. And so he started making compromises and alliances with people who didn't care about God's people. In a word, he started hanging out with the wrong kind of people. He wanted to protect himself, so he took up with the gang. You see, Ahaz forgot that we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, but we wrestle with powers and principalities and dark forces that oppose God. But God does not make us or call us or want us to make alliances with powers and principalities. No, Isaiah said, trust God. Don't rely on the gang to come to your rescue. That's only fleeting. Don't rely on the alliances with people who don't care about God's people in the first place. No, put your trust in God. Don't put your trust in those human leaders who are looking out for their own interests. But Ahaz did not trust God's promise that God would not let Jerusalem be defeated. And so Isaiah offers to him at this moment an oracle of salvation, an oracle of celebration. And even in the midst of a dark time, Isaiah can say with all confidence that light has come. The yoke of the people's burden has been lifted. The rod of the oppressor has been broken. Oh, the government of heaven is already seated and is leading us. You don't have to trust in those alliances. As long as we keep living and keep showing up and keep getting born, God is going to do something big in our midst. Don't trust government of man. Trust the government of heaven. Oh, they still didn't believe him. He said, there is a future for Jerusalem, and the sign of that future is the birth of a son in the line of the great King David, who will take charge of the government. And Isaiah assures both the leader and the people of God that God is the source of their peace and prosperity. God is the source of light, joy, liberation, and peace. God will provide this new leader as long as we keep getting born. God can do it. And here's the beautiful thing, because I'm sure someone said, you're talking in riddles, Isaiah. I don't get it. Sign is that their child will be born. And here's the thing, you don't even have to worry about what to call him, because his very name will be a description of what God is doing. And you'll know, you can call him Joe, John, Bob, or Shoe. But all you got to do is see what he does. He'll be a wise counselor. He'll exercise that government with judicious power. He'll be a calming presence. He'll be a provider of harmony and wholeness. And you know why you'll know that? Because the government that's in power now doesn't do any of that. The human leaders in the government are too busy doing their own thing that they won't lead with judicious power. But God's leader will do only justice and righteousness. So the people are not without hope. When the government can't and won't do right, the government of heaven remains God's promise for the future. The people do not have to wonder what God intends for them. They do not have to be satisfied with the status quo of failure and bad faith. They do not have to make alliances and accommodations to a government that is so unjust and so unrighteousness. A sign has been given to them. The birth of a child is the indication that new leadership is on the horizon. The light of God's reign will indeed shine. New life is possible even when our leaders and government fails us. Why do I have to say that? I had so many colleagues and friends, people of faith, especially this past week, that's just disappointed in the leaders, and they have been so depressed and so upset. And I want to remind them, even as I was sitting with this text, I want to remind them that leaders will always fail us. But we are the ones who have to have a word when they do. And that word that we have to bring is hope. Oh, I know we are surrounded on all sides. But the beauty of this prophecy is that all who experience failed leadership and bad governments that do not do justice and righteousness can know hope in God. All those who find accommodations with the morally and socially compromised leaders and find them futile and unworkable can embrace a vision of a new way of being in the world that does value justice and righteousness. How about this? Just call out the words. Just for once I would love someone at the press conference to say, do you think that we are being just? Have you ever heard anyone ask a politician that? What about justice and righteousness for all God's children? I want for once one of us to ask them, are you considering how to do justice and righteousness for God's people? Oh, those of us who are frustrated with our leaders and our governments can be assured that there is a government in heaven that inspires us with the vision of a just and righteous world. Why don't we just tell them about it? And I know what you say, oh, preacher, you done lost your mind. That's government. You don't talk to government that way. Oh, but we do. Why not? Too often we have those faith leaders talking about all of the power that they want. We have faith leaders talking about how they want the government to treat these vulnerable people worse because they are sinful. We have all these faith leaders talking about, I want more power. How about asking them to do justice and righteousness? And this is a prophecy that we need to hear right now, and a prophecy that we need to carry out into the world. When we have leaders and a government more interested in promoting the welfare of the wealthiest at the expense of poor and working people, we envision a better example of leadership and wise counsel of the people, which provides for everyone's human needs, and we ought to say so. When we have leaders in a government allowing our criminal justice system to treat people differently based upon race and economic status, we envision a just system where justice can be done in our midst and where justice can roll like water so that it touches everybody's life, and we ought to say so. When we have leaders in a government unwilling to ensure that everyone has a living wage, affordable health care, and a social safety net when things get rough, we envision a beloved community providing for the common good, and in which righteousness can flow like an ever-flowing stream. If we believe that, we ought to say so. And it doesn't matter who that leader may be. It doesn't matter who runs that government. We envision a better and more hopeful world. And I know you're saying, well, how do we know about God's intention to bring that justice and right? Because we've been given a sign. Here's the punchline. We don't sing about Jesus because we just like the tune. We sing about Jesus because that is our sign. That when hope was lost, when they thought that there could be nothing else, a child was born and changed the entire world, changed the whole land, changed the whole calculus of how the world lived. The birth of Jesus is our sign that God's reign will soon come. The prophets told us, Isaiah told us, you will be given a sign. When you think it all is over, when you think there's nothing you can do, when you think the world is just as bad as it's going to get, a child will be born. And by the way, that prophecy works for anybody. It works for the Muslim, it works for the atheist, it works for the Buddhist. As long as people are getting born, God is up to something. And here's how we'll know who those leaders are. Because they will act in ways that reflect who God is. They will be wonderful counselors. They will be mighty and peaceful. And we have found in Jesus one who embodied the very actions of wise counsel, a calm presence, peace and harmony. So we do not make accommodation when our government does wrong. We do not make accommodation to a government that deports vulnerable families who've lived here all their lives and don't know any other land but this one. We do not make alliances with a government that makes life difficult for our LGBTQ people to live, work, and thrive. We won't do it. We do not look the other way when our government seeks to take away affordable health care from children and families in desperate need of care. And we refuse to be silent when our leaders bully, insult, defame, and harass weaker people because they disagree with them or because they are a woman or because they are someone by different race. We do not seek accommodation. We join with Isaiah in giving voice to God's vision of a time when there will be no fear and no anxiety, a time when justice and righteousness will be done because the light of God's reign has been ushered in. So when we find ourselves disappointed in our leaders, we find ourselves just upset about what the government is or is not doing, we remind ourselves that no matter what is going on around us, no matter how hard things are, and no matter how much oppression we have to endure, God has not given up on God's plan. God has not given up on God's plan to do justice and righteousness, and neither should we.